look at Taiwan, this election does matter. On January the 11th, residents of Taiwan will once again elect their leadership in a vote that will shape the island's political climate and define cross-strait relations over the next 4 years. For its part, Beijing accuses the ruling Democratic Progressive Party of fomenting terror by restricting cross-strait exchanges with the mainland between individuals and enterprises for their own political benefit. Meanwhile, the U.S. is seen as using Taiwan as a leverage against Beijing through arms sales and other moves that challenge the One China principle. So how will Taiwan's election affect cross-strait relations? Will Taiwan resist the role of U.S. pawn? What will Beijing do to counter U.S. interference? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator, and Qu Jiang, assistant director of the International Monitoring Institute at Renmin University of China. We'll also speak via satellite with Professor Zheng Youping from Taipei University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Jiang, first of all, do you believe that this election will really matter and will make a big difference? What will happen in terms of the consequences?
No, I don't think this is a very important election. First of all, the situation happens in Taiwan has already been lasting for maybe the last 10 years. This is just a continuum of the existing situation. And also, again, the political forces existing in Taiwan is just holding their opinions and doing whatever they're good at. And I don't think this political power really matters. What really matters is that is there any major changes, radical changes, moving forward or backward, and how that's going to leverage America's reaction, and then how it's going to reflect on China.
Anna?
Well, I mean, in essence, Taiwan has become almost a puppet government in the sense that it's the only mainstay is a security issue, trying to be anti-China. The fact is the DPP, the ruling party, received a massive vote of no confidence in the last election because of their handling of the economics, and they still have no answer for this. You know, you can only support your political position so long before the economic realities kick in. And this is something that Tsai Ing-wen does not have an answer for. She's put forward no new ideas. She keeps talking about doing more with the U.S., but the fact is that 10% of Taiwan's workforce is working on the mainland. And China continues to try to press ahead with this. So the economic and political gravity is on China's side, and it's only being sustained temporarily by these moves in the U.S. I don't believe that Donald Trump really would actually back anything over Taiwan. He's using them just as a political pawn, as you was said in the beginning.
Exactly. Maximum pressure will be exerted for one reason or another by the Trump administration if he were to win the next election. Now, let me cross over to Professor Zheng Youping from Taiwan University for his thoughts on the latest situation there. Professor Zheng, what does the election actually mean for the future of Taiwan, the cross-strait relations, and the stepping in by the United States?
I basically agree with the previous two panelists. However, I would say that if Tsai Ing-wen gets reelected again, she might embark on an even more pro-independence policy line. In other words, she would do first in the internal arena, she's going to suppress, she's going to eradicate all the opposition forces that are critical of her approaches toward independence. On the other hand, she's willing, obviously, to put all her eggs in the basket of the United States. In other words, people here in Taiwan worry about her inclination to rely even more on the United States. However, looking at Donald Trump's performance in the past few years, people in Taiwan in general do not place too much trust in the Trump administration. So it is a tricky situation, and also it matters a lot to KMT whether KMT would stay on as a viable political force in Taiwan. That is to be observed. If KMT loses this battle really bad, then it probably means that KMT would never stand a chance to come back as a ruling power.
Thank you very much. Chang, as the Taiwan authorities are moving quickly so close to the security umbrella in the first place, and also probably would take Taiwan as yet another state of the United States of America to guarantee its future, will that risk a direct military confrontation? Will the mainland exhaust, or its patience will be utterly exhausted and will find a solution?
No, I don't think that's, I think this is just the breaking news will be searched by the journalists. They always like this big topic. No, my opinion is that's not going to happen in a very, very long foreseeable future. The reason is following. First of all, America is a very, very pragmatic country. So from the president to the politicians, and everybody understands this is possibly, this is basically impossible to just wage a direct confrontation with China. To think about it, China is another important country in the United Nations. China has also very important nuclear arsenal. And also China's missile power is covering probably the whole area near the region of the Taiwan Strait. So basically, well, China is in a very strong defense power. You cannot go outside, but just in front of the doorstep, China has all the power to defend itself. And also, this kind of a confrontation will have a huge loss towards America. Just think about it. Even in the Second World War, America has still the fewest loss of the soldiers. This is less than 500,000, comparing to China and the UK and the Soviet Union. American losses is just a very, very little. But American society has already gone to the extreme. They cannot afford huge losses. Americans understand that, so there's no way to put so many soldiers into that kind of confrontation, letting alone to put Taiwanese people into the danger. And also, secondly, we have to say China also wouldn't want to put Taiwan into that kind of danger. And also in the past, we have Japan and a third party. You know, Tai and her family used to have a huge interest in Japan, and Japan would like to use Taiwan and one of the balancers to make the stability in the region. But now you see Korea, Japan, and China are reaching certain amount of agreement, so the support from Japan will just back off a little bit. From this judgment, I think we're going to be okay in a very long time.
First of all, high-tech warfare doesn't mean the use of manpower massively, as what happened in the Second World War. Third, in a digital age, I'm afraid the theory of nuclear deterrence will be outdated. And also, don't forget the U.S.-Japan Security Pact that also covers Taiwan as an indispensable part of the sphere that should be covered by their defense commitment. What do you think of these three concerns, Anna?
Well, I think they're all valid, but I would add to on terms of my colleague. I disagree to the extent that Taiwan is a bright red line for China. And anybody who underestimates China's resolve to have this is something in the Constitution. It is not something that is up for debate. It's not something where China will give 1 inch. If they had the sense that the U.S. was making moves to put missiles in there or something like that, and this goes back to what our colleague said about how far will she go in trying to provoke China in order to extend her current administration. If she agrees to put in Patriots or missiles or do something on the offensive, China will act, and it would be foolish for anybody to. Now, you say that everybody's pragmatic in the U.S., but the fact is you have a president who's very erratic. He does not want a military confrontation, but he has this desire to be reelected at any cost, and he wants to look strong. So while he's making a trade agreement with China on limited issues on this phase 1 side, he might be tempted to look more muscular on things like Taiwan, possibly Hong Kong and Xinjiang.
To take a closer look at the issue of Taiwan in U.S.-China relationship, let me go back to Professor Teng Youping from Taiwan University. Hello, Professor Zhang. It's most likely,
yes,
if you follow the opinion polls in the United States about the campaign results, then Mr. Trump will win the next election. Whatever impact of the impeachment. And at the same time, if this assumption holds any water, it's also likely for Democrats to take majority seats in the Senate, also in the House, in the next election. In that case, do you think Taiwan will be featured more prominently in the bilateral relationship, the most consequential one in the world between Washington and Beijing? Do you believe enormous efforts will be made by Democrats to wage an offshore balancing act?
Well, overall, I would say that it is in Democrats' favor nowadays. And I would also say that, that the Democrats or the future White House administration might still place a very large percentage or a significant emphasis on Taiwan's role as a check against mainland China in the Asia-Pacific region. It is obvious that in Washington, D.C. today, the strategic or the foreign policy elite circle basically seems to move or to lean over to a new China scare consensus. And among that consensus, they would think that using Taiwan as a chip, as a pawn, would be a logical and a reasonable move. And from that viewpoint, you can expect that no matter who's in the White House after the 2020 election, or whoever controls the House and the Senate, they are going to use Taiwan as a pawn in the game for sure. And Tsai Ing-wen knows that fully well. But the thing is, Tsai Ing-wen also realizes, as our two distinguished panelists just mentioned, that Taiwan is so heavily dependent upon mainland China for its export, for its trade, and other economic activities. In other words, she is still trying to strike a balance between mainland China and the United States while relying on the United States to offer its military protection. And I have to say that Tsai Ing-wen is very cautious. She wants to go independent, but she wouldn't dare to go too far into that field, because that would be an outright challenge. And she probably doesn't have that kind of guts or chips in her pocket to do so. So we're going to see some tug of war back and forth in the coming 4 years or so.
I will go back to you, Professor Zheng, after asking Anna a question about whether the United States stands ready to have a direct military confrontation with the mainland over Taiwan, because recently some voices coming out of the top think tanks in the D.C. said loud and clear, look, most Americans believe, particularly the elites, have reached a consensus only a war could change China.
Well, the war would change the world, and that would be for certain. There is really no appetite to have a direct confrontation and to go at it directly. The danger is the indirect, as both the commentators have, my colleagues have said. You know, what happens if people miscalculate? Tsai Ing-wen is trying to balance her administration on a razor's edge. She doesn't have the economics to make it work, and she's continually and even more reliant on the U.S. The U.S. on its own, there's a tremendous amount of ill will towards China. You see it in China bashing on a daily basis.
But the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, has made it very clear. The Pentagon will spare no efforts to provoke the mainland and to make the situation across the Taiwan Strait very, very difficult to achieve the peaceful reunification. Given the fact that, and it's a huge given, the pro-secession green forces in Taiwan will undoubtedly go further down the dangerous road of independence, and that will seriously violate across the red line of the mainland. In that case, very quickly, Mr. Chi, do you think the PLA is ready to fight whatever the costs?
PLA is ready. We are always ready, I think. But I don't think, well, first of all, I have to agree with Anna. Actually, we're talking about one thing. I don't think China or America, anyone, either side will fire the first gun. It's just not of anyone's benefit. Just think about it. If America tried to defend Taiwan, and they're going to be huge cost economically and human resources. So it wouldn't do that. And even if they win, they still suffer a huge deficit. And the taxpayers in America wouldn't just allow it. Just think about what happens in the Korean War. It will be the same. American people just wouldn't stand that kind of losses. And also for China, it's the same situation. Humanitarian crisis and a financial deficit is going to be that. But think about who is the only benefit in such a kind of a confrontation. That's the only one, the small one we just ignored. That's the Thai. The Thai benefit hugely from this confrontation. So we have to mind that she probably, if the thing's going to smoothen up, but she will have the incentive to just put some crazy actions in here, push the bottoms on the missile or something else. So they will force the two giants to jump into the fight pit. That's something we need to put attention.
I just want to add one thing on here. The biggest danger here is that the U.S. is trying to goad China, to provoke China into taking some sort of military action in Taiwan. Why? Not because it wants to engage in a direct war with China. It couldn't. China can overwhelm Taiwan very, very quickly before there could be any mustering of U.S. forces to oppose it. The issue then is the U.S. can say China is this horrible country that takes over other countries. They want to create this narrative that China is the root of all evil. So this would very much play in, and this is, I think, the major concern.
That's true.
Exactly. But perhaps those who are waiting to see what's going to happen will use this. For example, when they look at the stress test in Hong Kong, they would take whatever reactions, particularly the tough ones from the mainland, as a barometer to take side on the issue of, the Grand Bay integration or whatever. But before we continue our discussion about the domestic politics or political ecosystem in Taiwan in the context of the upcoming elections, let's take a break, and we'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let me go back to Professor Zheng Youping. Hi, Professor Zheng. We're talking about not only the
Yes.
Authorization Act by the United States, also the serious escalation of military tensions. But first of all, I think crisis would come from within. Let's look at the elections itself. Now, what do you think of the differences that the pan-blue camp is trailing behind? I mean, Han Kuo-yu, the most convincing hopeful, is still trailing by a big margin behind Tsai Ing-wen, leader of the ruling party, the DPP. Is it true that the opinion polls could be trusted? What do you think of the accuracy and transparency of the opinion polls? And do you believe majority would vote for the DPP?
First of all, if we were to believe all the opinion polls that are shown on Taiwanese media today, we might as well quit the election, because obviously Tsai Ing-wen is leading Han Kuo-yu by a 40% to 30% margin. There's no room for any more meaningful fight and meaningful competition anymore. However, we also recognize that it is possible that some of these opinion polls are rigged. In other words, in the past year or so, we've seen new opinion polls, market research companies springing up all over Taiwan. At least somewhere around 10 of them came into the arena. And each one of them, suspiciously, it was rumored that they were supported by somebody from DPP or some businessman connected to DPP or Tsai Ing-wen. Anyhow, all these survey companies would regularly come up with opinion polls without statistical tables, without data, without questionnaire, but they tell you that Tsai Ing-wen is gradually gaining up on Han Kuo-yu or passing Hanguoyu or leading Hanguoyu by a significant margin.
Let's look at what's
Now,
behind the significant margin.
If you go to
Excuse
all
me,
the
Professor Chen.
mass gatherings, yeah.
Let's look at what's behind the big margin.
Yes.
What do you think of the alleged economic populism, meaning the DPP, the ruling party, has been able to leverage its administrative resources and let majority of the electorate benefit from social benefits? I mean, will that help buy the heart and mind of particularly those swing votes?
Well, I have to say that in Taiwan's economy today, the independent voters or the swing votes, they care a lot more about the economic well-being of themselves. But the economy doesn't seem very good. In the last year or so, the export sales have dropped by about 8 to 7%. And a lot more companies declaring bankruptcies. And the unemployment rate is slowly climbing up, especially among the younger generation. And not only that, we're also looking at Taiwan's economy. People are gradually less willing to spend money because people are unsure about the future. And that's a very dangerous sign. So I have to say that Tsai Ing-wen cannot promise much because with 3.5 years down the road, people haven't seen her done anything much for their well-being. And it's very significant. There is an interesting phenomenon. People here are remembering Jiang Qingguo. And Jiang Qingguo supposedly, in the Green Camp's viewpoints, was a dictator. But overall, you see in the streets, people are talking about Jiang Qingguo as if he was one of the best leaders Taiwan has ever seen. Why was that? Because Jiang Qingguo brought along Taiwan's economic miracle. In other words, that's an indirect indicator showing you that Taiwanese people are not very happy about Tsai Ing-wen's economic performance. So Tsai Ing-wen right now, even though she's leading in public opinion polls on paper, but the end result might be a very different outcome.
Thank you very much. Next year, ECFA will expire. What does that mean?
Well, it means everything will stay the same. I don't think this will generate a huge influence or...
I mean, the mainland authorities won't roll back the preferential policies in favor of our business partners in Taiwan?
I think everything will stay the same, even if it's expired. We're going to find some new things to maintain the situation in Taiwan. Well, a lot of people in Taiwan are thinking, well, the economic loss in Taiwan is because China mainland is trying to isolate Taiwan's economy. And I think getting independent is the only way out to make things better. But actually, they're wrong if you consider the data behind. 85% of the Taiwan's income actually come through the China mainland. So actually, without the mainland support, Taiwan would just be a wasteland, or probably even go backward to, you know, like 40 or 50 years ago. So I don't think this is a wise choice. But there are some poisons, you know, been whispered into Taiwan people's ears by now the ruling party, the DPP. They're telling people the wrong story. I think this is something we really need to pay attention to.
Well, given the crushing defeat of the DPP in local elections last year, do you think the ruling party, the pro-secession one, has learned any lesson the hard way? And what do you think of the economic performance in the island? Anna. Well,
the economics performance is dismal. Her ideological preferences are pushing her to an unsustainable, economically unsustainable side. I mean, all the statistics are very clear. Taiwan is hurting. What is her solution? None. She lost in these local elections because she's an ineffective economic administrator who's pushing her ideology above the needs of her people. How long can this go on is the question. When do the Taiwanese, who are generally very pragmatic, simply say, this is enough? We may not, you know, we might have some sympathy for keeping some sort of distance from the mainland, but it should not extend to committing economic suicide. So from that perspective, she doesn't. Now, in terms of China, I would disagree. It's not a question of just staying still. 2 days ago, the Chinese government announced a series of moves where they're going to give preference to Taiwanese youth who are educating, coming to the U.S.
measures will be taken by the mainland authorities to benefit particularly the economy in Taiwan and Taiwanese compatriots.
So here's a strategy that China is using not only with Taiwan but also the U.S. Instead of closing down, all right, and pulling back and disengaging as the U.S. is doing, China is going exactly the opposite way. They are opening up, not only economically to all nations, but also to Taiwan. They're trying to send a strong signal that if you want a world where there's a normalized trade structure of multilateralism, you have to consider what China has to offer, as opposed to what the U.S. Remember, Taiwan is they rely on their trade as their things. How can they exist in a world where the U.S. is trying to dismantle every single economic structure that's out there?
The excessive reliance on external trade relationship is exactly the next question that I'm going to raise to Professor Cheng Youping. Professor Cheng, 60% of Taiwan's economy is highly relying on export. Regional integration is one of the driving forces in the economy, while this export-oriented economy would be isolated after the RCEP is concluded next year, since Taiwan cannot participate. Now, what do you think of measures to be taken by the mainland authorities to encourage Taiwan rely more increasingly more on the mainland economy, so that we're going to have more sister cities, we're going to have more interdependence, so that the Green Party will find it very difficult to use economic populism for its benefit. What do you think of these prospects?
Well, I have to say that the changes in global value chain of merchandising production is still in flux right now. So it's kind of hard to say that where the global value chain would go to. However, Taiwan does remain heavily dependent upon foreign trade and trade with mainland China. 40% of Taiwan's export goes to Hong Kong and mainland China. In other words, every year Taiwan gets about 83 billion US dollars trade surplus vis-a-vis the mainland China market. Now, this is something that you can hardly change. Some people talked about United States market, but we look at the figure. Taiwan's trade with the United States constitute only a 10% share. In other words, you have to remain close to mainland China market. Otherwise, the whole economy will collapse. But at the same time, Tsai Ing-wen is walking a very dangerous tightrope, because she's telling people, look at Hong Kong today, and tomorrow it might be Taiwan. So she's inciting, she's trying to ferment an anti-China climate
very quickly,
inside Taiwanese society.
The last
and I
question.
have to say, sadly, it works among the younger people.
Very quickly, the last question is about the young generation in Taiwan. Chinese education officials said the number of Taiwanese students studying in the mainland universities now exceeds 12,000. In addition, preferential policies will be drawn up by the authorities in mainland to encourage more Taiwan young people to work on the mainland. Will that make a difference in terms of changing the mind and heart of the younger generation in Taiwan?
Yes, it's going to work, and it has been working for quite a while. Increasing the number of Taiwanese college students have shown their tendency and their willingness to go to mainland China to study, to go for a summer intern, and even work, or to start their own business in mainland China. Why? Simply because there is a bigger market, there are more opportunities for them, and here in Taiwan, low salary, bad situation, bad economy, doesn't hold out any hope for the younger generation of Taiwanese.
Thank you very much. That's the end of our dialogue with Professor Zheng, Anna Tangen, and Ju Jiang in the Beijing studio about Taiwan. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.